Hi there, I am John Rust, candidate for the United States Senate for the great state of Indiana. This past week, the United States Supreme Court ruled very firmly 9-0 that states cannot remove federal candidates from the ballot. Of course, this is what happened to me and many other Hoosiers with the Indiana Election Commission illegally removing me and so many others from the ballot despite my meeting every requirement. I had over 17,000 signatures from Hoosiers in every single county of Indiana, thousands more than my opponent and over 12,000 more signatures than required by law. Sadly, the will of the people in Indiana has been thrown in the trash by Attorney General Todd Rokita, Secretary of State Diego Morales, and GOP Chair Anne Hathaway and the Indiana Election Commission. Donald Trump said it best, so I'm going to let him speak to it himself.
Essentially, you cannot take somebody out of a race because an opponent would like to have it that way.
The hypocrisy of Banks, Rokita, Morales, and Hathaway on this issue exposes the rot of the Indiana Republican Party establishment. The most recent ruling by the Indiana Supreme Court did not take into consideration the United States Supreme Court ruling, so we continue this fight not only for myself, but for the 81% of Hoosiers unconstitutionally not allowed to run for office. Hi there, this is John Rust. I'm in front of the Indiana State Capitol building. We are going to have the rights of the 17,000 Hoosiers across the state of Indiana restored. They signed my petitions. They want choice for who our next United States Senator should be. It should not be left to the political insiders in Indianapolis to choose who Hoosiers can vote for. These are copies of the letters I just delivered to the Attorney General, Todd Rokita.
So tell me a little bit about the Supreme Court ruling that is allowing you to request to have your name back on the ballots.
The United States Supreme Court ruled that states cannot remove federal candidates from the ballot, which is what happened here in Indiana in my case.
In Your Vote 2024, Republican Senate candidate John Rust is calling on state officials to put him back on the ballot. Rust delivered letters to the Attorney General and the Secretary of State this morning. The Indiana Election Commission removed him last week because he did not vote in the two most recent Republican primaries. The decision would leave Jim Banks unopposed if it stands.
In this letter, I am calling for them to now come to my getting back on the ballot because they worked for Trump to get on the ballot in other states. Hoosiers deserve to have the same rights other states have.
Rust has a new lawsuit in Marion County Court claiming that he should be reinstated because a judge had blocked the two primary law while he got on the ballot. He says he still plans to appeal to the United States Supreme Court as well.
John Rust stopped in Fort Wayne today trying to get his name back on the ballot for U.S. Senate. Rust wrote a letter to Congressman Jim Banks asking for his support after the Supreme Court ruled to allow former President Donald Trump to remain on the ballot in Colorado. Now, Banks is running to replace Mike Braun, you may know that, and was facing off against Rust. Rust was removed from the Senate ballot after several challenges to his candidacy were filed, citing a law that we're talking about. That one prohibits candidates from running whose last two primary votes didn't match the party they're trying to represent. The Indiana Capitol Chronicle reports Rust's two most recent primary votes were Republican in 2016, Democrat in 2012.
I delivered a letter to the congressional office of Jim Banks calling for him to join me in all Hoosiers being able to run for office, especially for federal office. You know, we should not be throwing people off the ballot that have met every legal requirement just because the party establishment does not view them as a candidate that they want. It should be up to the people.
Republican John Rust is fighting to return his name to the ballot for U.S. Senate. The Indiana Election Commission and the Indiana Supreme Court both found Rust ineligible to run as a Republican. Today, Rust went to Representative Jim Banks' office with a letter asking his opponent to help get him back on the ballot. He cites a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision and says it should apply also to him.
Jim Banks should be asking to get my name back on the ballot because the United States Supreme Court just ruled that Donald Trump could not be removed from the ballot in Colorado. The United States Supreme Court ruled that the Colorado State Supreme Court could not take Donald Trump off the ballot, and I believe that will be held for here as well in Indiana because Hoosiers deserve a choice.
Essentially, you cannot take somebody out of a race because an opponent would like to have it that way. And it has nothing to do with the fact that it's the leading candidate, whether it was the leading candidate or a candidate that was well down on the totem pole. You cannot take somebody out of a race The voters can take the person out of the race very quickly, but a court shouldn't be doing that, and the Supreme Court saw that very well. And I really do believe that will be a unifying factor, because while most states were thrilled to have me, there were some that didn't, and they didn't want that for political reasons. They didn't want that because of poll numbers, because the poll numbers are very good. We're beating President Biden in almost every poll. New York Times came out yesterday with a very big poll for us. So they didn't like that, and you can't do that. You can't do what they tried to do.
Today is day 30 of asking Jim Banks to sign the pledge to the people of Indiana to remove Mitch McConnell from Republican Senate leadership immediately. Jim Banks, who was bought and paid for by McConnell, remains silent. Sadly, McConnell remains as Republican leader and continues to work against the border wall and fiscal responsibility. When he is bought and paid for, he has no voice. Just on Friday, Jim Banks campaigned with Lindsey Graham. That says everything you need to know about how Jim Banks will be voting if he does get forced on Hoosiers to be our only choice for the U.S. Senate. I recently put an ad out on this. Here it goes. I am John Rust, and I approve this message.
This is what happens when DC insiders get their way. And if the swamp establishment gets their way in Indiana, Mitch McConnell's hand-picked stooge, Jim Banks, will be our next senator. Now more than ever, Indiana needs an outsider in the U.S. Senate. Conservative businessman John Rust is running to be that outsider and drain the Washington swamp. Say no to Mitch McConnell. Vote no on Jim Banks. Vote yes on John Rust.
Sadly, Jim Banks continues to ban 90% of Hoosiers from entering his congressional office in Indiana. Folks went in to deliver my letter to Banks but were turned away, so they had to mail the letter to his third-floor office from the mailbox on the street below. Wow, that is the state of democracy in Indiana, and how rotten career politicians like Jim Banks have become, and it's why we have to have term limits. I promise you, as your next United States Senator, my office, both in D.C. and here in Indiana, will always be open to all Hoosiers. After all, you as the taxpayer are paying for it. And the continuing story of Jim Banks crying about anyone opposing him, another doozy. Jim Banks yet again is trying to block me from airing ads across the state of Indiana. We have ads on TV across the state, and Jim Banks is crying about it. Special interest PACs funded by the elites in Washington are pushing ads for Banks. I remain the lone Hoosier in this Senate race working for Hoosiers, not outsiders. Here's the ad Jim Banks does not want you to see. I am John Rust, and I approve this message. This election, the stakes for Hoosiers are higher than ever. That's why I've stepped up to run for the United States Senate. As chairman of the board, I've been responsible for feeding tens of millions of people every day, and now I'm fighting for the rights of all Hoosiers to run for office. Indiana is filled with incredible people who can serve our community, but the political insiders are blocking them from running for office. I'm fighting for the rights of all Hoosiers, and I'll do the same in the United States Senate. So rest assured, this fight is just beginning. When I got into this race, I knew it would be climbing a mountain, but when you are fighting for the rights and interest of all Hoosiers against the establishment, it is a glorious fight. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.